So good morning. It's my privilege to be bringing the first presentation of the day to you. And I will be sharing some of our experiences with on-farm habitats and habitat farming. Our work follows the premise that food production and nature conservation are both very important and need to be balanced, as Anne was already saying. And we seek to identify and strengthen the synergies between the two of them in our work. While we expect farmers to produce most of our food, we obviously can't put all the responsibility for nature conservation on them at the same time. If we want to stem the global decline of wild organisms, there's an urgent need for nature conservation across landscapes using a variety of tools. They might include strictly preserved nature preserves, nature-friendly farming, but it also reaches into our own backyards where we can landscape with native plants and contribute our part to nature conservation. Because large areas of land are devoted to agriculture, farming can significantly support or damage the biodiversity depending on how the farms are managed. So with the presentation today about on-farm habitats and habitat farming, I hope to show some practical ways how farms can support native biodiversity and might even benefit from it. So when we consider the potential for habitat farming on a farm, we ask those two related questions. One, what do farms provide for wild nature? And the other, what does wild nature provide for the farm? And we approach the first question from the perspective of ecological analogies. An ecological analogy refers to a human-shaped habitat which, while it's not the one that a given organism might have been co-evolved with, offers enough similarities or analogies to be ecologically functional for that species. For example, some shrubland birds who might have evolved to take advantage of post-fire shrublands might find a suitable ecological analogy in a shrubby pasture. Or wetland butterflies who had evolved around beaver ponds might find a suitable habitat in farm ponds if they're loosely managed or in wet meadows on a farm. Or grassland birds who have evolved to breed in the Midwestern tallgrass prairie sometimes find suitable ecological analogy in a mature hayfield. Plants are also not distributed evenly across the landscape. You might say they're looking for ecological analogies to the habitats that they have evolved with. And when we're trying to assess the potential of a farm for native plant conservation, we usually start with creating a habitat map or a vegetation map, such as this one that was done for the Hudson Valley Farm Hub in 2015. And then we go into each of the habitats and inventory the plants that are there, and we tally them and create a table, something like this. And from that table, we can learn that fields, for example, actually, let's go like this. Fields that logically on a farm make up the largest amount of the area, have a good number of wild-growing plant species in them, but only 37% in this case were native species, and very few of them were actually rare species or species otherwise of conservation concern. In contrast, the riparian corridor takes up a small area of the farm, has a large number of wild-growing plants, and a large percentage of them are native plants. And a significant number were rare plants or otherwise interesting to us. And then there are habitats that take up a very small area of the farm, but have large numbers of rare or unusual species in them. So after doing those kind of studies on several regional farms, we have learned that some habitats have a much higher potential for preserving native plants than others. And the dry and nutrient-poor meadows, for example, seem to be analogous to fire-maintained open areas for several plants, and these are some examples of them. And then with the native plants come the insects. For example, these are some rare native butterflies that their caterpillars feed on this grass, which is a native dryland grass, little bluestem. Another habitat that has good potential for native plants are wet meadows that are occasionally grazed or mowed. They're analogous to beaver meadows for the native plants, and they might host interesting plants like these. They often have wetland butterflies associated with them. Again, their caterpillars need wetland plants to eat on. And wet meadows also host some amphibians and reptiles of conservation concern. Hedgerows on farms provide habitat for native plants that usually are in the forest or along the forest edges, but they can also shelter insects, small mammals, birds, and provide travel corridors for forest animals through the farm and make the farms more permeable for wildlife. Finally, ancient forest remnants, analogous to pre-colonial forest, are often found on farms where they have not been cleared for fields because they were either too rocky or too steep or too wet. And in those ancient forest remnants, we find a number of shade-loving native plants that are hesitant to recolonize forests that have grown up on former fields. They really stick to those forest remnants in the landscape. So one half of habitat farming is to recognize the value of these already existing on-farm habitats and to maintain them as habitats for native plants and their associated animals. The other half of habitat farming is to create additional on-farm habitats to both support native biodiversity for its own sake, but also for beneficial organisms that can help the farmer with crop pollination and pest control. So these are some of our native pollinators that we have in the region, and these are some examples of the predators and parasitoids that can help the farmer keep the pest insects at manageable levels. And I want to give a lot of credit to the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation for the amazing material that they have made available for people who are looking for resources to find practical, on-the-ground suggestions how they can support pollinators and beneficial insects. And in this book, there's the citation that says, increasing the availability of flowers, especially native wildflowers, is often the single most important strategy for increasing the abundance and diversity of beneficial insects. Like pollinators, such as bees and butterflies, many insect predators and parasitoids feed on flower, nectar, or pollen during one of their life stages. And in addition to flowers, beneficial insects need alternate sources of prey or hosts, as well as shelter, for example, for hibernation and reproduction. So these are the things that the native beneficial insects need. And now I want to show you a few examples of intentionally created on-farm habitats that we've been involved with. And I should say that a lot of those habitats actually can receive cost sharing from USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, as well as technical assistance to the farmers through the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, EQIP. And this is the list of on-farm habitats that can be created that I will be talking about, and I'll go through them one by one. The first one are the field-scale perennial meadows, with the example of the native meadow trial at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub, which was started in 2017 because we were searching for ways how to put some of the cornfields that are in very flood-prone areas at the Farm Hub into permanent cover. And we were wondering if we could do that while at the same time increasing flower abundance on the farm. So we established 3 trial areas. There are 2 of them on this image. They're rectangular, 1.5 acres, and each of them is subdivided into 3 experimental plots. One experimental plot at each of those sites received a species-rich seed mix that was custom designed with the help of Kelly Gill. She's somewhere here, up here, from the Xerxes Society. So she's one of those technical service providers that can help farmers think through what they can do on their farms for pollinators. The second experimental plot at each site was seeded into a less species-rich seed mix with lots of grasses in it as well. And then the third experimental plot was not seeded with anything. It was left fallow as a control field. And because we were establishing those meadows without use of any herbicides, we started a year prior to the seeding with the site preparation and put in a cover crop, 2 cover crops. And then prior to seeding, the fields were harrowed 3 times again to really create a weed-free, nice seed bed for the seeds. And then we seeded them on, when was it? May 19th of 2017 with a Great Plains no-till seeder, so that's that machine here. And then we spent approximately 10 person-hours per acre managing during the first and second season, and then the management requirements went down. And as Kelly Gill, my mentor, had predicted, during the first year the native meadows slept. So this is showing the amount of seeded plants that actually germinated and started covering the ground during the first year in the A mix and in the B mix. There were very few of the seeded plants. And Kelly was telling us, expect them to sleep during the first day, during the first year, to creep during the second year, and then to leap during the third year. And that's what they were doing. Actually, it almost looks like they leapt already in the second year, but that was mostly because of a few species that came in very quickly. And then during the third year, the vegetation became more diverse. And this is what it looked like on the field during the first year. This is one of the experimental plots seeded with seed mix A, taken a picture of from the same location throughout the first year. And then in the second year, we had a lot of flowers. And then in the third year, the vegetation became more diverse. And the flower abundance during the second year, when you compare side by side mix A and mix B, in July, they were undistinguishable. Both of them had a huge peak of black-eyed Susan, but then in September, there were still lots of flowers in the A mix and none anymore in the B mix. And then the third year, the pattern was similar in July. Both of them had flowers. There's a graph showing the peak of flowers in July. And then in September, again, the B mix had no more flowers left and the A mix continued. So the peaks became lower, but in the A mix, it stretched out over a wider range of the season, and that's what we were hoping to accomplish. The control fields were dominated by horseweed, very small little flowers during the second and third season, and now we'll see going forward which other native plants are starting to come in. So if a farm does not have enough land or not the resources to establish one of those wildflower meadows, there's the possibility to use those same species and just create smaller pollinator borders. They can be planted or seeded. And in this case, we used black plastic to eliminate the existing vegetation, tilled it, and then seeded the flowers. And it worked out really well. Beetle banks are elevated, narrow strips of perennial vegetation that gets integrated into vegetable fields. And the idea is that the native bunch grasses seeded in those beetle banks serve as overwintering habitat for ground beetles and other beneficial insects, and then colonize, during the growing season, colonize back out from the beetle bank into the adjacent tilled fields. If all of that sounds too involved, there's always the possibility to just unmow the field edges or roadsides, and that immediately gets you some flowers onto the farm as well. Another strategy is the rewilding of former farmland. That's another experiment that we've been doing at the Farm Hub. This is a strip of pretty wet soil, thank you, along Hurley Mountain Road. And in 2016, the farmers stopped tilling it, and we just allowed it to revegetate. And I also had the opportunity to establish 3 small trial plots where I hand broadcast a mix of native wetland plants to see if we could boost the flower abundance a little bit. This is the part that was not seeded, so that's just the native vegetation and non-native vegetation just growing in from seeds that were already present in the environment. And already at the end of the first season, we had seen 160 different species colonizing this formerly bare field. And after 3 years, we had a lot of native plants coming in, although from a distance it does not look striking when you go in and look close. They are there and the flowers are there. And then when you turn around and look into one of the small plots where I actually seeded, you see a lot of flowers, even from the road. But they were mostly sneezeweed, is that little yellow flower. But it brought in a lot of insects. They liked it. And then if the farmer does not have the land or is not willing to commit to perennial vegetation, there's always the possibility just to include annual insectaries or cut flower plantings within a vegetable rotation. So this is again at the Farm Hub, an annual insectary, and a cut flower garden at Hawthorne Valley brings in lots of insects. And then while not strictly an on-farm habitat, I want to remind you that residential landscaping around farms can make a difference too. And if we invite native plants into our gardens, then that can make a difference what beneficial insects and pollinators can move into the neighboring farms. And resources such as these books can help landscape gardens and backyards become habitats for nature conservation as well as sources for beneficials for nearby farms. And that's important because we're all in this together. Let's not expect the farmers to do all the work for us. So I want to thank you for your interest, for coming out today. I want to thank Anne and Conrad for ably facilitating and coordinating all our research at the Farm Hub, and of course the Farm Hub as an institution and all the farmers and colleagues there who have helped in so many ways, and Hawthorne Valley as an institution and my colleagues at the Hawthorne Valley Farmscape Ecology Program for their help. Thank you.
Anyone, I just want to get it on the mic because we're live streaming. So.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, the more diverse seed mix, the wildflower seed mix, I was wondering if you could speak to the sourcing of that, like where one could purchase that seed mix and what the relative cost would be.
Okay. Yes, so there are a number of seed companies out there. Most of them are located in the Midwest. And the biggest one on the East Coast is Ernst Seeds. And I like to go to them because I'm hoping that the ecotypes of the plants are mostly from the East Coast. I don't think they can do that for all species, but they try. And they also tend to be, the prices tend to be lower than some of the other companies, I think just because it's so huge. Our seed mix here was relatively expensive because I was still inexperienced. We paid $900 per acre, but take that with a grain of salt because since then we've modified the seed mix and we're now seeding another meadow at the Farm Hub that's only $300 per acre. So you can really come down once you've honed in on which are the workhorse species that you want to invite in. Does that answer the question? Okay. Yes.
When is the best time of year to cut back a rewilded
depends a little bit on what your goals are, and what the machinery is that you have available to do it. I always say my favorite time is really late in the winter, before the breeding birds come back, but so that you have all the seed heads and the fruits that might still be in there standing through the winter to feed the birds, and also to provide winter shelter for insects. But there is no perfect time, because you will still have some insects overwintering in the stalks of the vegetation if you cut it in late winter. So one thing to do is, if you have a large enough area, not to mow it all in one season, but to do half of it and keep the other one as a preserve from which then organisms can recolonize the area that was mowed, and then switch it around the next year. Yeah. There's another question back there. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you have any experience with, like, for example, the Canadian thistle, like stuff like that, where if you're trying not to mow it when it's flowering, are there certain plants that like will compete with that so you don't get that coming into your fields?
I do have experience with Canada thistle. I don't think I have a silver bullet yet. So that rewilding area along Hurley Mountain Road, sure, Canada thistle is there and it's trying to move in. And so the farmers actually spot mow that. So before, just as it starts flowering, they go in and try to mow it down so that it doesn't go to seed. And we are following the advice of some extension office, I forget who it was, who said don't mow it down too low, because then the plant puts all its resources into spreading sideways underground. Mow it relatively high, but low relatively high, yeah, but low enough so that you get all the flowers. And then the plant puts its resources into regrowing the existing stalk and doesn't spread even further. But no, I have not found somebody yet who can compete with an existing patch of Canada thistle. All right.
Great. Thank you, Claudia.